Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 5 about the executive branch. It's Lesson 11 about choosing the nominees for president. In this lesson, you'll learn about party primaries, party caucuses, the importance of Iowa and New Hampshire. You'll learn about party delegates and party conventions. First of all, let me get a bit of terminology out of the way. A candidate chosen to represent a party is the party's nominee. So, for example, in this picture in 2016, Hillary Clinton was chosen as the nominee of the Democratic Party. So our question for this lesson then is, how does a party go about choosing who will be its nominee? On this slide, the pictures of Donald Trump, who was chosen by the Republican Party to be their nominee. Well, how does a party go about doing that? Let me first of all refer you back to the steps of the Electoral College that we learned about in previous lessons. In the Electoral College, we end up with a president who was chosen by electors, who were selected by state legislatures, who did that in accordance with the expressed preferences of the voters in their states. So the voters go and vote. The state legislature then, on a winner-takes-all basis, selects electors that match up with the voter preferences. Those electors then cast their votes in the Electoral College to choose the president. The reason I'm referring you back to this is because the process that political parties use to select their nominees is actually quite similar. So let's look at the party nomination process and diagram it out the same way that we diagrammed out the Electoral College. Let's begin, instead of with the president being elected, with the nominee being selected. The nominee is chosen by people who are called delegates. They're not called electors like in the Electoral College. They're called delegates. In the Electoral College, the electors meet in the Electoral College. In the party nomination process, the delegates meet in what's called a national party convention. The delegates are chosen by state political parties. So, for example, the Republican Party, say in Nebraska, will end up choosing some people from Nebraska to be delegates, who then go to the National Party Convention and cast their votes, and the person who gets the most votes at that convention then becomes the nominee of the party. But the state political party, in making that choice of delegates, takes into consideration the preferences expressed by party voters during what's called the primary and caucus process, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So much like the Electoral College, at the base you have voters who are expressing their preferences for who they want to be elected. Then you have a state organization, in this case the state political party, that takes those preferences expressed by voters and uses them to then choose delegates that reflect those preferences. Those delegates then get together in another meeting. In this case, it's the National Party Convention. And they then choose the nominee of the party. So how exactly do the voters then express their preference to the state political parties in this process? We know in the general election, where the Electoral College functions, that on Election Day in November, voters go to the polls and they express who they support for president, and then the state legislatures can use that to select slates of electors to actually participate in the Electoral College. Well, again, this is very similar here. The way that the state parties find out the preference of the voters is some sort of election is held in the state. One way that that election process can be done is in something called a primary. A primary is what you think of as an election. Voters go to a polling place, they're given a ballot of some sort, they get to go in a little voting area where they can secretly by themselves cast their vote. It takes just a few minutes, nobody's looking over their shoulder, no one ever knows who they chose to vote for or not to vote for. It's just like an election in any other situation. And the primary characteristic of it is to remember is that the voting is private. So this kind of system for casting votes within a state, within the political party process, to let the state party know who you support as president, is a way that is attractive to casual voters. They can stop by the polling place on their way home from work or school or whatever. They can take just a few minutes and cast their votes, and no one will ever know who they voted for. An alternative way that states can go about getting the members of their party to express their preference for president is to conduct what are called caucuses. Now, a caucus is not like a primary. You don't get to go in and go into a voting booth and vote in secret. Instead, caucuses are held in big rooms, perhaps a ballroom at a hotel, or perhaps someone's living room in a small neighborhood. And what happens is everybody from that voting area, that neighborhood, who's a member of that political party is invited to come to this big public meeting. And then at the big public meeting, they are allowed to hear speeches offered on behalf of candidates. They end up staying there for hours because they're not just considering presidential candidates, they're also considering candidates for governor and senator and representative, etc., etc. So they may sit there for hours and listen to speeches given, and then eventually they have a chance to cast their vote for who they prefer to be the candidate of their party for president. But when they cast their vote, they do it in a very public way, perhaps raising their hands in front of each other. In some situations, the supporter of one candidate is asked to go stand on one side of the room, and the supporters of a different candidate are asked to go stand on the other side of the room. The point is that in a caucus, these are public meetings where your preferences are made known to the rest of the public, and they take a long time. So the kind of people that show up to these sorts of meetings are diehard supporters of candidates, people who are really committed. These are not casual voters that come to caucuses. Some state political parties choose to stage caucuses. Some state political parties choose to stage primaries. These primaries and caucuses are then strung out over the election calendar. This is an example from 2012, the calendar that the Republican Party followed. Now, it's different in 2016, it'll be different in 2020, but the differences aren't important. The important thing to note here is how they're spread over time. So Iowa goes first, then New Hampshire, then South Carolina, and eventually all the states and even territories where members of that political party may live, such as Puerto Rico or American Samoa, have opportunities to vote. So the Republicans here in 2012, when it was time for their primary caucus in their state, had a chance to go to a poll or to a caucus meeting and let the party know who they would want to see as the nominee. Now, there's a couple things to notice about this calendar. First of all, because not all the states vote all at once, the states that vote early have a disproportionate influence. The reason for that is that candidates who do poorly in those early states are going to look like losers, and then their fundraising will dry up. Remember, people who donate money to candidates are doing it because they're expecting something in return, and you don't get anything in return from a loser. So candidates that do bad in those early races will not stay in the race. Those who do well in those early contests will then have momentum to do well in future contests. So the early contests have a disproportionate impact on the whole race. Another thing that I want you to notice is that most presidential election cycles, by the time you get around to mid to late April, we have a pretty good idea of who's going to be the nominee of the party for reasons that I can explain in a little more detail as we go along here. But the basic idea is that enough of those delegates that I previously talked about have been chosen by that point that you can already figure out who's going to have a majority of delegates at the party national convention. You already know who they're going to be voting for. So you already know who's going to win the convention well ahead of time. So these contests are spread out over time. Now notice that Iowa and New Hampshire are first. And the truth is that Iowa and New Hampshire are traditionally first, and they make sure they're always first. The calendar we're looking at had the primary and caucus season beginning in early January in 2012. It used to begin in February. That's when Iowa and New Hampshire would vote. But it's progressively moved earlier in time because other states have have tried, threatened to move their primaries or caucuses ahead of Iowa and New Hampshire to try to steal some of that influence that Iowa and New Hampshire have. And Iowa and New Hampshire have always been determined to keep theirs first, no matter what. Because every 4 years, when the candidates come to Iowa and New Hampshire, they end up spending a lot of money there. And they spend a lot of money there because they realize the importance of these early states. You do well there, it helps you a lot. You do badly, it probably kills your campaign. So they try very hard there. They spend a lot of money, and Iowa and New Hampshire always want to take advantage of that. So they stay at the beginning of the primary and caucus season. So each state is assigned a certain number of delegates that then it divides up based on the vote on that state during primary or caucus elections that take place there. So, for example, you can see the state of California there with 172 delegates. When you eventually have the California primary, a certain number of those will be assigned to one candidate, a certain number will be assigned to another, and they're pledged to, when they go to the National Party Convention, to vote for the candidate they've been assigned to, at least on the first ballot. Usually there is only one ballot. So these delegates that are pledged to particular candidates then show up at the convention to vote for them. And we've been able to total them up ahead of time by following that calendar. Okay, after Iowa, we know how many delegates this candidate got. We know how many this candidate got. After New Hampshire, we know how many more this one got, how many more the other one got. You can keep track of it over time and figure out before the convention who's actually going to win. So the delegates come to the National Convention to vote for the party nominee. That's when the party nominee is officially chosen. Even though we figured it out beforehand, that's when they are officially chosen, is when the delegates show up at the convention and vote for them. Just like the presidential candidate in the Electoral College. We may know who's going to win the Electoral College beforehand, but they're not officially voted on until the Electoral College votes. So it's the delegates at the National Convention that officially choose the party nominee, even though we know who the party nominee is going to be based on the votes in the primaries and the caucuses, because those primary and caucus votes then select the delegates who then go to the National Convention. So by keeping track of what happens to the primary and caucuses, we can know who's going to win the National Convention beforehand. So because we keep track of those delegates and know the convention winner beforehand, maybe you'll ask, why even bother to have a party convention then? If we already know who's going to win, why go through the formality of it? The reason is because the party conventions still serve a function as pep rallies for the candidates. The candidates essentially get 3 or 4 days of free publicity with television networks covering the party convention, where there's a bunch of speeches being given in favor of the nominee of that party. And the party conventions, which are held this summer before the presidential election, tend to give their nominees a boost when they are held. So let's review what we learned in this lesson. What happens during a primary? Is a primary a public meeting? Or are candidates raising funds during a primary? Or is it a party convention? Or does private voting take place during a primary? During a primary, private voting happens. People go to polling places, they step into voting booths, and they vote without anyone being able to see who they voted for. In contrast, what happens during a caucus? Is a caucus a public meeting? Or are candidates raising money in a caucus? Or is it some sort of party convention? Or does private voting take place in a caucus? Caucuses are public meetings where people have to end up expressing their preference for a candidate in front of their friends and neighbors. Why is the most important caucus in Iowa every year? Is it because it's the first to vote? Or is it because it's the last to vote? Or is it because they send the most delegates to the convention? Or is it that the party headquarters are in Iowa? The correct answer is Iowa is important because Iowa goes first. Who officially picks the party nominee? Is it the primary voters, the caucus voters, the party national committee, or the party convention delegates? It's the party convention delegates that officially select the nominee. While we all know who the nominee is going to be beforehand, they aren't really the nominee till the delegates vote for them at the national convention. So what function does the party convention mainly serve now? Is it a pep rally for the nominee? Is it the beginning of the presidential campaign or the end of the presidential campaign? Or do they ratify new laws at the party convention? Party conventions are basically big pep rallies for the candidates of the parties. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 5. It'll be Lesson 12, about removing the president from office.